Welcome to the WTR Healthcare Happenings podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. Today I'm joined by my healthcare equity research colleague, Robert Sassoon, to discuss his initiation of coverage report on NurExone Biologic, a preclinical biopharma company transitioning to its first in-human trials with a novel exosome platform at the frontier of CNS regeneration. NurExone trades on Canada's TSX Venture Exchange under ticker symbol NRX and on the OTCQB under ticker symbol NRXBF. I just attended Oppenheimer's excellent CNS and Neuromuscular Summit in Miami Beach, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Robert. So good morning and thank you for joining me.
Good morning to you, Tim. Glad to be here.
Robert, NurExone's core platform and science are built on exosomes. Can you start with a brief 101 on what exosomes are and explain why research interest in them has surged in recent years?
Yeah, sure, Tim. So exosomes are tiny packages that cells release. They're nanoscale vesicles, somewhere between 30 and 150 nanometers across, or for our American audience, roughly 1 to 6 millionths of an inch. That's about 1,000 times smaller than the cell that actually makes them, and nearly every cell type in your body actually produces them. So exosomes themselves aren't really new, but our understanding of what they can do is relatively fresh. When they were discovered in the 1980s, scientists thought they were basically cellular trash bags, a way for cells to dump waste. But over the last decade, that picture has flipped completely. We know exosomes are a courier system for cell-to-cell communications. They carry functional cargo like proteins, lipids, and RNA. And that cargo can actually reprogram the receiving cell. So healthy tissue, in effect, sending instructions to damaged tissue. That's the core of the excitement now. Therapeutically, they tick a lot of boxes. They're not cells, so you avoid the tumor risk and the personalization headaches of all cell therapy. Their membrane shields the cargo from breaking down in the body. And because they're so small, they can slip across barriers like the blood-brain barrier that stop most conventional drugs cold, which matters enormously, especially when you're looking at treatments for central nervous systems. So you can use them as a therapy itself or as a delivery vehicle. The clinical activity really backs all of this up. Nearly 100 exosome-based trials have launched since 2021, most of them in regenerative medicine. The exosomes in these trials are primarily derived from mesenchymal stem cells, or MSCs, found in tissues including bone marrow, umbilical cord tissue, umbilical cord blood, placenta, adipose tissue, and menstrual blood. MSCs sourced exosomes dominate really clinical work because they have demonstrated an advantageous mix of safety, biological activity, and manufacturability. So just to be clear, no exosome therapy has yet been approved by the FDA, but the science is really moving and moving fast. And it's still early days because most clinical programs are at the phase 1 or 2 stages. But one caveat I have to make to listeners is that we're not talking about the exosome skincare and spa products you already see on the market and that are heavily advertised. Those are not the regulated ones we're dealing with.
That's really fascinating. So where does NurExone fit into this landscape, Robert?
So think of exosome therapeutics as a spectrum. At one end, you have companies using naive, unmodified exosomes and relying on their natural cargo. At the other end, you have heavily engineered platforms which genetically modify the producer cells so the exosomes come out preloaded. Now that develops more control, but more manufacturing and regulatory complexity at a much higher cost. So NurExone, where does it sit? It sits somewhere in between with a fairly differentiated model. They take naive MSC-derived exosomes, keeping that clean safety and manufacturing profile, then load a therapeutic payload afterward without engineering the cells. So they call that platform ExoTherapy. Now, their lead asset, ExoPTEN, is the first product of that platform. The exosome is the vehicle. The cargo is siRNA, or an RNA molecule that silences a gene called PTEN. So ExoPTEN is dual action. The exosome is naturally home to the injury and calm the inflammation, while the payload drives the actual nerve regeneration. So a major differentiator for NurExone is the target. the central nervous system, specifically acute spinal cord injury and optic nerve damage, where no regenerative options exist today. That's exactly where an exosome's ability to cross barriers and carry a gene silencing payload earns its keep. So PTEN does matter. It's a useful protein that acts as a molecular brake, stopping cells from growing and dividing out of control. But in the nervous system, that same brake can work against you. So after a spinal cord or optic nerve injury, the damaged nerve fibers try to regrow, but PTEN is what stops them from doing so. So as long as PTEN is switched on, the neurons essentially can't regenerate across the injury. So ExoPTEN combining the exosome with the siRNA effectively inhibits the inhibitor. And in multiple preclinical animal studies across several indications led by acute spinal cord and optic nerve injury, ExoPTEN has shown to promote both regeneration and neuroprotection quite impressively.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, Robert, I know that most early stage biotech firms historically are at the mercy of their contract manufacturers. By acquiring a master cell bank in the US and setting up a subsidiary, Exotop, to run it, NurExone has brought its key raw material in-house. What does that vertical integration bring, and why do it before ExoP10 is in the clinic even?
Yeah, that's an important question to ask, and you're right. Uh, Tim, it really buys three things for them: control, quality, and optionality. So, control first. For an exosome company, the master cell bank is the raw material. Most preclinical and clinical biotechs rent their raw material from contract manufacturers and live with whatever they get. So, by owning a source of naive exosomes through Exotop, NurExone takes that dependency off the table. No exposure to a CMO's pricing, its capacity, or quality on the one input that really matters most to NurExone. So on quality, batch-to-batch variability is one of the biggest reasons clinical exosome programs stall. So I mentioned earlier that about 100 exosome-based clinical trials have been initiated since 2021, but I would add that only about 60 are still active. The others have, for the most part, stalled. So NurExone owns a single donor stem cell bank preserved at patch zero, meaning the earliest and most potent stage of the cell. It has shown reproducible batches of exosomes off it. That consistency is exactly what the FDA really scrutinizes. So NurExone is solving a known industry bottleneck before it becomes its problem. Then there's the optionality, and that's where the LOI recently signed with the Florida-based BioXTech fits in. NurExone owns the cell bank and the know-how. BioXTech brings the US GMP manufacturing ability and capacity. Rather than spend heavy capex on its own plant, NurExone is looking to pair its proprietary input with an existing Florida facility. In other words, lower overhead and a faster route to clinical and commercial supply. The caveat is that it's still a non-binding LOI, so a key catalyst looking ahead is converting it into a definitive deal. So owning the cell source also means that there are no third-party royalties eating margin, and the same asset can be sold to third-party researchers as well as into the burgeoning regenerative aesthetics and cosmetics market, generating revenue even before ExoP10 is ever dosed in its first patient. So why now? A stable GMP grade supply is a prerequisite for an IND, not a bolt-on. They're clearing the manufacturing question early while it's cheap and turning Exotop into a revenue engine during the most cash-hungry phase of the company's life. So it's not a side project, it's de-risking the drug development while building a second value driver at the same time.
That all makes a lot of sense because one of the key takeaways I picked up at the Oppenheimer conference I alluded to a moment ago is that there's a lot of great ideas out there, but they fail when it comes to implementation and also the vulnerability to supply chain. So this makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
finally, Robert, wrapping up, can you summarize the key milestones investors should watch for in the months ahead?
Yeah, sure. So on the clinical side, the big one is the IND progress for ExoP10. The company has a handful of steps left before it can submit an IND to the FDA. That includes finalizing certain analytical assays and completing safety and toxicity work. And those gate the IND submission targeted for the first half of 2027. However, based on the company's latest MD&A, which they released last week, NurExone is actually exploring first in human use of ExoP10 via the compassionate use or expanded access route. which really could accelerate the drug's path to the clinic ahead of an IND, a full IND exhibition. Now, on the commercial side, the milestone to watch is the BioXTech LOI converting into a definitive agreement. That's what turns Exotop from a strategy into a real business. Behind it, the first commercial exosome revenue, which our model has starting in the first half of 2027. For a preclinical company, revenue before a drug is a genuine inflection point and a helpful source of funding. And turning to the capital markets anyway, watch how NurExone funds the next 12 months. That's an important thing. And that could include a potential US mainboard listing. A NASDAQ uplisting would broaden institutional access and potentially give it an opportunity to tap a larger pool of funds as it advances its clinical program. The NervGen president, NervGen is one of NurExone's peers, uh, had an uplisting from TSXV to the NASDAQ at the start of the year and shows that that kind of move can amplify a positive story. So in short, watch the IND, the path of the first in human, the BioXTech conversion, the first Exotop revenue, and the funding plus a possible US listing. Clear those milestones, and NurExone shifts from a preclinical story to a revenue-generating clinical stage one. That the NurExone thesis. That's the NurExone thesis in a nutshell.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Robert, for joining me today and sharing your thoughts on NurExone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, industry-specific symposiums, and conference schedules. We will see you next time for another edition of the WTR Healthcare Happenings podcast. Finally, a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, Krista Fitzpatrick.